Alrighty, so it's about go time. Thanks everybody. Day 2, afternoon. You're probably fairly tired, but not as tired as you'll be tomorrow at 4:20. So this is pretty good. I got you while you're fresh. I'm Ian, and before I introduce the panel, I want to ask a favor of this audience. So I want you to envision that you're on this panel. I want you to think about being asked to share how things didn't always go right in your own enterprise, how you've had challenges, how you've gotten past some of those challenges. And I want you, as you think about being on this panel and being asked to do this, think about how you'd like the audience to behave in that regard. Because these gentlemen are going to share some fairly sensitive things in their own enterprises. So a couple of asks of the audience. We've turned off the camera on this, so I plead ask not to record video on this, because people that are up here are going to talk about real challenge and the way they got it to work. And I want you to afford them that courtesy to do that in an open space. So we'll treat this as Chatham House rules. Obviously, any learnings you take from here, treasure those, right? Use those every day. But don't attribute what you've heard to any of these organizations. So, with that, I'm going to start with Lance. Introduce yourself, tell us why you're here, and then we'll get into the fun. It's probably just on. It's on.
Indeed it is. I had no faith. Hi, my name is Lance Peterman. I am the Platform and Strategy Lead at Merck as part of their Identity and Access Management Center of Excellence, and have been there almost 9 years now.
Hi, I'm Bernard Diwakar. I'm the Workforce Identity Architect at Intuit. I've been at Intuit for the past 5 years now.
Frank Villavicencio. I head the product management team that is responsible for our client identity and access for ADP. Been there for almost 2 years.
All right, let's see how this goes.
So, hi. I'm Steve Hutchinson. I'm the Principal Identity Architect for General Electric, and I ask you to bear with me as my voice has progressively gotten worse as the day has gone on. I've been with GE about 5 years.
So let's set a little bit of context. Guys, why don't you just briefly talk about where does you and your team, if you have them, sit in the organization, and if that's changed in, say, the last 6 months or the last year. So give us a little organizational context. Any order.
First of all, I'm a little jealous because I think their mic is a little higher than ours, but that may work out well for Steve's case. He is a trooper for sticking with this. Our group is located within the CISO's office, specifically called IT Risk Management and Security. It's a nice alliance that we have because we have a very close partnership with our risk management group, which I think most people in identity will agree that risk and identity are kind of joined at the hip. And the only recent change that we've had in the past couple of years is we've reached a kind of a steady state with some of our identity services. Because our group is largely under the CISO, the operational components where things are more turnkey, for example, like turning on a federation connection, those have been turned over actually to the IT side under operations and support. So that's how I would kind of differentiate that.
So in our case, it's slightly different than Lance in the sense that we are part of the classical IT org, and my group, which is called as the Workforce Technology group, rolls up into the CIO. And this hasn't been recent, but this has been there for as long as I've been there. And there's good synergies because as we kind of have discovered over the time is everything we do around identity, one of the biggest stakeholders has been the end user, which is the workforce. And then aligning along the Workforce Technology group made sense for us.
So in our case, I focus on the external facing side of our identity portfolio. I have a twin, I guess, evil twin inside of ADP that is in charge of the internal workforce. Both of us, however, roll up to our chief of product, which I find very unique and somewhat convenient. we have, in parallel to our product organization, is our security office. And they dictate policy, they measure risk, they assess, but we're the enforcement. And so what that creates is a scenario where we get to play the usability and user experience card with a lot more freedom than I think would otherwise happen.
Our organization is it's gone through a lot of changes in the last 4 months, actually. We were kind of pretty far down the chain as a regular enterprise corporate IT department. And in the last 4 months, as GE has moved into a new digital technology organization, we have gotten our own CIO. So identity has been elevated up 3 levels in the leadership organization. And the woman, Deneen DeFiore, who is our CIO now, was and actually continues to be the CISO for aviation. Also in the last 3 months, the Information Security Technology Center, where our group is headquartered out of, every one of GE's 10 businesses has a CISO, and there's a chief CISO, a chief information security officer. And her name is Nazrin Reza, and she just moved her offices from New York down to our office in Richmond. And so we're not part of the CISO organization, but we have an incredibly tighter partnership now with the CISO organization, who we consider to be our primary business stakeholder.
So we've heard a couple of different patterns. So we've heard direct sort of report to CISO, roll up maybe directly more to CIO, product, and then sort of digital enablement with a CISO alignment, I think is maybe the way to categorize it. So show of hands in your own worlds, who rolls up into a CISO-like organization? A couple of folks, yeah. Justin, you report to yourself, so that's how you roll up in the org. How many of you roll up in some other part of CIO organization? Okay. What about product, directly rolling into product? Okay. We're doing that as a warm-up. So the value of this session is, there's a little bit that I'll try to extract from these guys with prepared questions. It's more interesting for everyone, your questions. So be thinking. I'll try to look up from time to time. Just raise your hand, shout it out. We'll drill in because we've got some really interesting stories to tell here. So Hutch, you touched on this a little bit in terms of who you consider to be primary stakeholder, and you mentioned the CISO. So other guys, who are your kinds of stakeholders that you most consider like the biggest stakeholder? How often do you interact? How do you interact? What does that relationship look like?
So my case is twofold. Is the chief of product and our CSO. Very much, I think, in equal standing. Now, we have at least a touch point at steering committee every 3 months. We're rolling out some new initiatives, and so the frequency now is more like every month and a half now. It's a little more under the microscope, but in a good way. We're getting funding, but with that funding comes accountability.
So in our case, we have the classical stakeholders that you see in any enterprise: security, audit, risk, compliance. But also there's the largest stakeholder that we have recognized very consciously is our developer community, the workforce itself. And so there are a bunch of OpMechs, and a couple of OpMechs I would say are around. We have established executive sponsorship and steering committees that we meet monthly. And this OpMech has tremendously helped us while driving programs, especially. And one of the things at Intuit, culture-wise, escalation is not a bad thing. So these OpMechs kind of help us to raise visibility to the top leadership and get their help and guidance.
Ours is pretty diverse and really kind of varies by service layer. What I'll call our governance area has a lot of the traditional stakeholders that Bernard just detailed. And then one of the things that has happened at Merck in the last few years, prior to that point, we were very much a buy versus build shop when it came to acquiring software. Our bias was somebody else has already done this. But as Merck has tried to, like most companies, transform digitally, we are now building a lot more than we're buying. And kind of in alignment with Bernard's comment, we have a huge developer community that, frankly, right now, I would say we don't have what I would call the best relationship with. Not that it's toxic or anything at that level, but it's just non-functional. And that's the one where I would say is probably our greatest focus, because we have some great platforms that are available to the developers if they're aware of them, but you get farther into the line of businesses in the health life sciences community, and they don't know that we have an authorization API, for example. So they're partnering with a third-party developer to get a product brought in, and because they don't know who to talk to, they go out and they go, oh, there's an open source one, we can just grab and use those libraries. And needless to say, that creates some headaches. So that's, they're probably our most fertile ground for stakeholders. Some of the other traditional ones that were already mentioned are certainly within Merck's as well.
So let's throw it back to the audience for a second. For those of you who at least have a developer constituency that you're trying to serve, show of hands, do you think your relationship with that developer constituency is pretty good? Maybe show of hands, pretty good relationship? Could be better? Needs a lot of work? Okay. So a personal observation is that developer constituency is probably the last constituency that identity professionals have learned to interact with meaningfully. And I will certainly observe sometimes the best guidance that, I bet Lance, you have this scenario, is you want to give a developer is don't develop anything. Like, don't build something, because we have 2 or 3 or N of these things, right? So there's that challenge too. But I want to drill a little bit more on this, which is, we talked about some stakeholders, and we've got a sense of organizationally how we're reporting up. Do you find sometimes there's tension between the way you report up in an organization and your stakeholders, right? Are those priorities not as aligned sometimes? Or if you're a corporate structure, and I think, Hutch, GE, knowing what I know about your corporate structure, may be an interesting scenario where you have very large pillars of business, but with this more digital core team. Talk to me about some of that tension that you've observed, if there is any.
Well, no, and there is. So it was when we were a pure kind of IT shop and we were centralized. 2 things. We weren't just isolated from our CISO organization, but there were organizational barriers between our central IT services and what the businesses were doing. Previously, the businesses also had a lot of their own IT shop. Identity was one of the first things we pulled together to do centrally, but it also distanced us from the people that we considered the ones that we were trying to develop the services for. We were leveraging what we felt was our expertise, and that caused us to adopt if we build it, they will come type of thing, rather than really doing serious voice of the customer with those business teams. Same thing with the CISO organization. It wasn't until we started to pull those 2 organizations together that we realized, instead of just being a cost center, as you referenced a couple of years ago in the presentation, that we could be a true business enabler for them, because we were going to be the service that would help instantiate those controls that they were looking to put in place, and that just by consuming the identity fabric, application teams and developers could meet all of those requirements without having to do additional work on their own.
We're following this pattern.
apparently,
I can see
yeah.
the pattern. I was thinking I
fear
was going to
change.
jump over here. Yeah. In our case, it's been I'm lucky to say that I'm sort of the last stakeholder in a big journey, in that we use our security office organization as a partner. They're probably the biggest demand generator for us. But we've learned along the way that if you build something that developers would not really want to adopt, if you're not sensitive to that community, then they will just not adopt it, period. And that has forced us to master this ability to prototype, to do early pilots, to iterate and do data-driven UX tuning, and understand, for example, how a specific end-user experience happens in, say, in Europe or in Canada versus in a big conglomerate multinational. Something that I think we weren't attuned to early on. There's a lot of work to master that, and it's a very challenging situation. But I think we've understood that is our only path forward. Is if we don't cater to the developers, then they won't adopt it, no matter how critical it is or how many times they get beaten by the security team through audits and whatnot. And so instead of resisting that, we're embracing this idea that we need to become very developer-centric.
Yeah, just to break up the pattern here.
You have to share, you know.
I think the thing I would add there, and I know Steve deals with this, and I know we've got a few other GE folks in the audience as well. Our biggest challenge in terms of the tension is we are a highly regulated company, and I know GE is as well. ADP has some constraints also, but so one of the things that we wind up dealing with from a business perspective is they always want to get through the, thou must part of the transaction, if you're following an RFC here, to getting to the shall part. And so we have to satisfy those pieces first, which the good news is we have the stick to support that, but they still come begrudgingly. For example, when we start asking them questions like, how are you going to manage privileged accounts within your new application? The first answer is, well, what's a privileged account? So, that's not, and it's not their fault. That's not their job to ask those questions. That's our job, and frankly, it's Risk's job, which they're a very good partner for us in that. And they kind of help reduce that tension a little bit. But we're now getting to the point to where we're getting better at governance. So now we're kind of crossing that Rubicon into the developer communities to have the lunch and learns and go, so what are you guys up to? And how do you want to approach those things?
And if I could ask you a question, so are you sensing some sort of change in the developers community that they're now more security minded, more identity minded, if you will?
I think there's definitely a sense of that, particularly when you're dealing with things like authentication. No developer wants to write their own authentication library. So when we can show them a list of our APIs that are written in solid Swagger format, that they can just take these code snippets and snap it into their applications, that's very well received. When we start getting into some of the more esoteric pieces around governance, that's when the brace kind of comes in. And we have to continue that conversation. But we start with the stick in that respect, and I think that helps the conversation.
Yeah, and I agree to all the panelists here. There's a lot of similarities and scenarios that we run at Intuit as well, which is very same. But one thing I wanted to point out is to our earlier question about where we are positioned in the org. I think it's been a very strategic benefit for us in the sense we play that part wherein we bring the different stakeholders to the table and have these concerns, challenges across adaptability as to why certain part of the company doesn't want to use a solution. So it has, in a way, we have become that gluing point to bring all these voices of customers and collectively solve for it. So that's one of the things that has helped us.
So it sounds like in your case, Bernard, that essentially being host to multiple concerns allows you to sort of get to a resolution of those groups. And what's given you sort of internally either the remit or the charter to go do that work? Or is that something you took and essentially said, look, if we want to get to a solution before the sun runs out of fuel, like we got to go and be that host and be that person to solve those problems? How's that worked?
I would say it's worked great, and it's actually benefited our business outcome because we've taken the bull by the horn and say, okay, we can't just keep saying, hey, people are not adopting. Instead of complaining, we just went and reached out and said, let's come together. What are the concerns? How do we want to solve this and make this solution better so that it can improve the adoption as well as, I mean, if you think about the one Intuit business outcome, you're reducing risk and meeting all the regulatory requirements that we have to also comply by.
So was there anything that you did for your team or your team did in terms of training or techniques that you used that you found to be especially useful here? Or is it just actually just being there was almost enough and just showing up and asking those questions? How did it work operationally?
The one other mindset that we kind of introduced across the team, regardless of the role, we continue to do this, is that it doesn't matter what role they play within our group, they in a way are brand ambassadors to what we do. And so at every level of meetings or conversation, people bring that empathy towards the customer to say, okay, be very transparent and say, why are we doing this? What is this solving for? And then also listening to their pain points. So applying all this consistently, and it doesn't have to be only at the sponsor meeting or the steering committee meeting, but it's even in the day-to-day scrums when people interact, we encourage this practice. And that's why we definitely see that benefit, and we hope, I mean, obviously there's room for improvement for us, but we always try to do better than what we did in the past.
This is interesting. You're describing a product management discipline right there. Right? You're getting people together. For us, the metaphor I use is that, if you ever call a deli and you say, you pick up the phone, it's like, well, I want the sandwich with the salad, and then we would just say, you want fries with that. And it would be a given that whatever you ask, you get. And so everybody gets a yes. And do you want Diet Coke with that? Or okay. And then we would also have the situation where it was very typical of our security department, where they'll come up with a mandate. There's been a security issue or a new policy, and I would describe this as the hand grenade that just gets thrown over, and then it blows up right in the middle of everything we were doing, without any warning, without any sort of discussion. It's just so we've evolved from that to a place where we're more proactive, more assertive in figuring out what needs to happen first. We can't say yes to everything, but I think that if I could say in my team, what I observe is it's obviously empathy, it's all of this, but you have to be assertive, and by that you have to establish credibility. So of my team, it's required that if you're going to challenge something, you know why you're challenging. And I think that pushes the needle a little bit. So now you're not order taking, you're actually managing a product.
So that, Frank, before Hutch chimes in, that couldn't have been a comfortable transformation, right? And so there's got to be some cultural inertia that was maybe, just maybe, working against you on that.
Well, I only been here for less than 2 years, so I can't necessarily say that I'm done with this. In my earlier session, I was talking about metrics, and so one of the metrics that I use within my team is a cholesterol level. So cholesterol being a proxy for stress is very, very high, and it's sort of normalizing, which kind of tells me something is moving on. But you're right, it does require a lot of investment in harnessing good relationships, but it can't be that that you're a doormat, part of the metaphor, but you have to stand up, you have to have a backbone, and that takes energy.
So I will observe, interesting using the cholesterol metaphor, I'm pretty sure red wine helps reduce cholesterol levels, so is there any? No, never mind, there was no parallels. Hutch, maybe touching on that product management mentality or that transformation to that, I know you've got some challenges that you've been working on there, so.
Yeah, so we started a product management focus in the fall, really taking our 8 identity program management areas and defining products as our customers were consuming them, so the business teams and the application teams, which was very new for us. It's still new for us. So we've got some really good product management talent that we brought in to teach us better strategies for how we deal with that. I did want to touch on something that Lance had said, because I think it's important. One of the biggest transformations I see in our organization is we always saw ourselves as the guards at the gate who were, trying to make sure that everybody was following the rules, that, GE wasn't accumulating fines, and it was through our security services that we were going to help prevent that. So we were very big on the stick to get people to leverage the services, and not so much on the carrot. And part of this transformation to what GE calls a digital industrial piece was because GE was terrified of the small little niche players, because GE arguably makes the greatest aircraft engines in the world, but we don't make hardly any money off of them anymore. We make money off of the services and the analytics, and that data is valuable. But 3 guys in a garage can come up with a really cool algorithm or something, and if they can deliver that service faster, better, and more responsive to the customer than we can, it doesn't matter how big a company we are. Right. We really started to look at that in our space as well. I know Justin did a talk on shadow IT, and instead of trying to beat the shadow IT out of the org, you've got to make sure that your services are as easy to consume and are as amenable to the development process as anything they could go out and find on their own or develop on their own. We want to be that center of excellence. So it meant forging a partnership not only with these product management teams, but to really start to see, bring those developers in, not as potential, enemies or who are going to screw up our services, but as people who are going to help us mature our services to make them something that everybody wanted to consume.
Cool. So let's take a pause. So questions. Justin, you got a question? Then we'll go there.
Yeah. So we're not recording, right?
We're not recording. And you don't need a mic either. So.
That's actually why I was asking, because I'm plenty acoustic for the local room. So I was actually waiting to ask a shadow IT related question, because I was curious if any of you guys have run across a case where, some set of developers somewhere down in your organization actually made something better than what you were providing, and what did you do about that?
So I'll say yes. Again, when we brought this group of developers from San Ramon, at first they were GE Digital, and we were just GE Corporate. Now we're all GE Digital. But they really kind of ran their own show. And suddenly, these new mobile apps were showing up with a new mobile authentication screen that somehow tied back into our regular SSO service. And it was beautiful, and it was easy to use. And we kicked ourselves for saying, well, why didn't we develop that? So, and I will say, my first reaction was, those bastards. I'm gonna go kill this. And then it was, fortunately, what we did instead was we brought them in and asked them how they did it, how they tied back into it, and it turns out that they were leveraging the APIs that we wanted people to consume. They were just doing it in a very elegant manner that we didn't even recognize them as our own services. So that, and honestly, that was the first kind of partnership between us and those developers. So.
I was going to say, I've had kind of both edges of the sword, and they were both around authentication APIs. We developed an innovation center in the Czech Republic, and these guys were young and motivated and just ready to start raising hell. And we were like, we're here to help you whenever you need, just come talk to us. And that was too slow for them. So one group, the API platform created, they saw a gap in our authentication API that wasn't technically there, but we didn't advertise it well. And so they created an authentication API, and when they, I kind of had maybe not quite the vitriolic reaction Steve did, but I'm like, well, crap. So we started looking at what they published and what they did, and we're like, this is solid. There's no reason for us to go, no, use this. They were using the APIs as intended, and what that became kind of very similar to Steve's pattern was that was an opportunity to say, hey, let's start talking regularly, especially because some of our customers were going to them before they would come to us on other issues. And we're like, and we promised to do the same for them, that, if they were asking for API development, we go, well, these guys may be a little better suited for that. The opposite end of that equation was we did have somebody who didn't know that we had an authentication API. They rolled their own product. They started issuing keys to anybody that asked for them. And we isolated it. We were very polite. But we did, let them know that they actually needed to use what the API team had developed, and we needed to have a transition path to getting all of the existing consumers of that API onto the new API, so that we could at least have a single API instead of them multiplying like rabbits.
Yeah, so there are two parts in the story I want to share. One is where, to the question about shadow IT, I think what we've done is we've kind of identified some groups where there's a potential of something coming out of that group. So we've kind of taken that heads on and kind of plugged ourselves in those groups, so that instead of them coming up with a solution on their own, it's a collective solutioning and brainstorming. So we are kind of in that frame of mind now where we have our team members strategically part of some of these core quote-unquote shadow IT groups, so that we can develop the solution in a collaborative way. On the other side, to Lance's point, we had a case about a few years ago where they went outside the standard way of implementing an authentication flow. For the right reasons, we were able to track that down very quickly, and then went ahead and got them onboarded to the right way to do things.
So before I go to Dave, just one quick question for the panel too, and Frank, chime in on this and keep adding. How many of you curiously offer some form of open office hours for your teams to meet with other teams, or some other vehicle? I'm curious about like real tactical things that you do, so that when you find, oh wow, we have 2 authentication APIs, or someone comes like, hey, I think I'm about building another authentication API, like Lance, you guys get to go like, hey, glad for you to come to office hours, but no, that's a bad idea. So I'm curious too about techniques. So Frank, when you talk about your success, and then talk about some tactics you've used there.
So it's ad hoc, I'll just say. There are forums within the company that allow for some of this exchange to occur, and we take advantage of them. But for the most part, it's partnerships that are developed in the battlefield. And I think that, again, it's a currency. I like to use credibility as a currency and empathy as another currency. One of the things, just to maybe address the shadow IT for us, what we've learned is, so time to market is primarily the reason why shadow IT. So I'll say that's a big contributor. So instead of trying to accelerate our cycle, which we are trying, but there is just a natural cadence. We're trying to now embrace more of a model of open source, where, okay, look, we're just going to allow you to partner with us and contribute to the source code. And so that helps us. We're starting in that journey. I think that's most likely to give us a good outcome. And then the other is there are times when we just didn't see, for example, registration flow was one of my eye opener. There's a certain business unit that deals with small businesses. And for them, the registration flow needed to follow specific characteristics that were very different than other groups. So trying to force them to embrace our flow was just not a non-starter. And then we ultimately realized, well, this makes sense for us to absorb. And so some of that empathy, some of that partnership helps. But I think there is a balance of speed and just doing the right thing, just curtailing to the right thing. It's hard. It's ad hoc at best in our organization.
This one vehicle that has helped us is we have introduced the concept of demo days. It's not necessarily office hours, but it's a discipline that happens once every quarter where regardless of which group they are in, they're requested to come and participate and share what they've developed or even if it may not even be a code, even if it's a concept, right? Even a straw man or even a presentation that kind of articulates the solution and the problem it's trying to solve. That's a vehicle that has definitely helped us.
Cool. Hutch?
Yeah, so John Letnan, who is our SSO integrations leader, is here this week. And he actually has a session tomorrow at 10 o'clock. John does maintain office hours for application teams, which was really important when we wanted to shut down or put into containment the solutions that we no longer wanted to support, web access management, and wanted to promote more of the self-service type of things. So John has office hours where he gets feedback from those application teams and provides solutions. So John's job becomes not dealing with every special snowflake who's coming along, but is providing back standard solutions they can use. Where we're trying to improve is kind of at a higher level than that. We have a customer advisory board as part of this new product management piece where designated representatives from each of the lines of business, we get together every 4 weeks and they talk about where they feel they have unmet needs or they're about to get into development or product streams where we're going to need to provide something that's not there yet. But again, it's dangerous because we know those people. We don't know the people who may have the actual needs. So we are actually trying to think of new ways to open up, to allow people to communicate with us who we don't know yet. But we haven't been as successful with that.
Yeah, we don't have open office hours. We kind of inverted that model. We kind of moved the mountain to Muhammad, so to speak. And I don't know that one's necessarily better than the other. I think one has advantages. What we've started to try and do, particularly with our key development constituencies, we had a recent change in the past year where there's like a senior VP over application development. Not that all of the development takes place within his org, but his job is his sole job is to understand where all the development's taking place. And so some of the outcomes of that was there is now kind of following the Scrum methodology, but in a very loose sense, there's like a super Scrum where it's almost like the equivalent of a change management meeting, but it's more on the dev side. And they have a stand-up meeting weekly that we participate in where they can ask us questions, but more importantly, we can ask them questions.
What were you thinking?
Yeah, no, we say it much more politely like that. And so we do that with the development teams, and then we're also doing it in partnership with our Cloud Center of Excellence as well as our Mobility Center of Excellence. And I think that the latter is where I think there's going to be a big opportunity because and I know we're not alone, we're still not doing mobile authentication very well. And I know most people feel that pain point, but I think that's where there's going to be a lot of opportunity for us long term.
Cool. Dave, you had a question?
So I'm probably not the only one here experiencing a bit of deja vu, harkening back 15, 20 years ago and hearing the same song talking about the relationship between security professionals and the engineering organization, and how hard it was to get engineers bought into security requirements as a design and architecture product. I think that sounds familiar. And I'm hearing a lot of the same kinds of approaches for addressing that, especially
the same office that we're located in, there's an entire organization dedicated to secure development and secure coding practices. And there's the best education program I've seen of any company I've worked at to try and embed it. It's the first thing new developers learn when they come on board. It's a really good point, because when we built the new office out in San Ramon, the intent was to hire 1,500 developers who, used to develop in the Valley, to teach us how to be a more agile startup organization. And what we learned, we learned a lot of stuff about doing agile development, but we had to teach them a lot of stuff about, here's how you do secure coding, and here's how you do secure development. But, I mean, the company recognized that and built a program around it.
Yeah, the two biggest allies we've had in applying that rigor, we had a major breakthrough early in 2016 where we officially got security adopted into the SDLC at Merck. And there was an early gate that they had to go through, and it was in partnership with our risk. So for some people who's on Archer, they may consider that a four-letter word. But for us, it's worth its weight in gold, because early on in those projects, many, not necessarily all yet, of these engineering projects or these development projects are having to pass through that gate early on. And we're able to identify some of the key risks associated around, pick your identity service area here. That has helped us tremendously. It's not getting us 100% coverage yet, but getting that gate early on, because we are so heavily regulated, they know they have to pass through it at some point, has helped us in applying some of that rigor behind that.
So in our case, what's helped to maintain that rigor that you're pointing about is eliminating the time it takes to get through that review process, right? What we've done is we've shifted we have empowered our developers to say, you're the ones who are closest to the system you're building. You take a crack at doing the threat modeling on your own. Obviously, there is the security awareness and the trainings that are helpful to these developers to how to do a threat model, for example. But then once they've done that, then the number of reviews they have to go through, that's where we have tried to optimize. That's a work in progress, is how do we get them to get this done quicker, so that, to your point, how can they deliver the product quickly and in faster speed, right? So we are investing a lot of time to make sure, very conscious, and making sure eliminating all the redundant review process that doesn't really buy anything, but have those enough checkpoints with key people involved in that, so the decisions can be made faster.
Much like you, Lance, we've also have a security training, and security is part of our SDLC. One of the things that's working well for us, and again, I don't know that I can claim this for anything I've been part of, but I just inherited, is that there is an intrinsic knowledge of assurance in our company, which I find to be quite interesting. So people are thinking about use cases, and immediately they map to, that is an assurance level 1 type use case, or assurance level 2 type use case. And in most of the developers' mind, this means I need to engage so-and-so. And so in a way, it starts triaging. This flow can go here a little more faster, a little less problematic. Over here, I know I need to reach out. And then there are toll gates depending on the path. That has helped us scale, because not everybody can engage. Even if the developers were willing, we wouldn't have the capacity to do those reviews fast enough. I think that has helped.
So we've talked a lot about programmatic techniques. But what I've heard hints around, and this is one I want to draw on, and this, by the way, is not a question you've heard, is cultural changes. I've heard about process changes. I've heard about methodology changes, and reducing the number of gates to get through security review, or doing a scrum of scrums across multiple business lines. Okay. What, if anything, in terms of cultural changes have you put in place to find success? Or what are your hopes? What are your wishes for cultural changes in terms of if they're needed, and how you'd roll them out?
I'll just say, for us, is the religion of data. And here's what it is. we had now taken a very conscious effort in equating and measuring everything we do to metrics. And so if, for example, we had fraud in a particular flow, before and after, we can immediately show that, and that is very convincing. If we can show that in the same process, we have also increased the volume or reduced the time it takes, that's even more compelling. If in the same flow, then we think about, hey, you know, our likes or rating in the App Store has increased as a result of a better authentication experience, plus, you know, and I think that religion, that focus on data has helped us gain more momentum.
I can go. I think I can sum it up with a very short sentence, right? It's speed as a habit. So that's something culturally we are trying to make sure it's applied across every level, right? And to my earlier point, that in turn helps us to reduce the gates that were redundant in the past. So speed as a habit across every level, whether it's at the requirements gathering or collaboration or whatever. Make speed as a habit in decision making, making sure identifying the blockers and how do you go about escalating it and getting the right resolution. So that would be the one-liner for us from a cultural standpoint.
Yeah, speed is obviously super important for us as well, but what was slowing us down was that GE was a company that had adopted Six Sigma as a religion, which when you're engineering aircraft engines and power turbines, you absolutely want to make sure you drive those defects down to as close to zero. Unfortunately, somebody at GE looked at that model and said, that's a great way to do software development as well. And we were turning out products that our customers loved had we delivered them 2 years earlier. So the biggest culture change that we've had to go through is that it's okay to fail. Not that it's okay to fail security or to risk security holes, but that it's okay to not have that solution work the first time. To be okay to say, I don't know how to do this, I can't make this work. And reaching out to other people before, because prior to that it was, I have to be perfect, and my product has to be perfect.
Yeah, I couldn't help but laugh as Steve was talking about that. In addition to my day job at Merck, I also teach at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, software architecture and design. And so part of my foundational teaching in this is I have to teach them all of the methods by which software has been developed over time, because unfortunately they may still step into an organization who's using extreme waterfall, you know, for lack of a better description, or, you know, as Steve indicated, from a quality assurance perspective, you know, they're doing Sigma to try and develop software, and, you know, the answer I always give them is, you need to know this, but I'm sorry. But it is important that they know it, because there are elements behind that emphasis on quality that can infuse what they're doing. Even if you're not adopting an entire practice from a TQM perspective or whatever, you know, process you're adopting, it can influence that. So, you know, it was kind of fun, and that's one of the things that I enjoy about teaching the class, and that's why I love these conferences, is I get to find out more things to go share with them as part of this, in kind of getting more directly back to Ian's question. I think what we do, because I think especially for those who raise their hands that are lining up within the security organization, for the longest time we've been considered the party of no. You know, we find out that something's happening and we stop it. You know, not necessarily permanently, but it's halted until we can go, you know, we have to kick the tires and inspect the carriage and everything. And what we've tried to do is become the party of risk. And that's language that you can express more in business terms, which is much more friendly to them, of, okay, you can do this, but, you know, and basically you know, we call it pulling the brakes. And the only time we absolutely pull to a stop is if you're going to break a law based on what you're doing, you know, there's a good chance the brake may be a slow pull. And we'll identify it as a risk, and then they have to come up with an approach to mediating it.
So I want to just do a quick follow-up on Moving from, say, a Six Sigma mindset on quality, I think one of the things I've heard maybe underneath this is some language of empathy, right? We talked a little bit more about stakeholder alignment, and I think this is a bit of a cultural transformation that many organizations are going through, where there used to be synonymous to quality was, well, this is how I cared about my customers, producing the perfect product, right? But and I was a product manager at one point for IBM, and it took a little while to ship a product. But it was about quality, right? We wanted to deliver those things. And it was meant out of a place of goodness to deliver the best thing possible to the customer. But the thing that isn't in their hands isn't usable. And so now I think there's this other idea of, we want to have empathy for the stakeholder, but that may mean that we want to do the best thing for them, but they also need an answer today, right? There's no value in, we're going to study the hell out of this thing and give you the sweetest smelling SPML interface. It's still a damn SPML interface and no one's going to use it.
Well, and look, I think we also have to recognize that usability and UX has matured meanwhile. And so now it's not just hearsay, it's something you can measure and you can be very precise about.
Glad you had a question for us?
That's exactly a great follow-up question, and you already some of the people know it very well. So what I also care is the other side of the story, users, the people who are using your services.
Right.
Do you have, I know the adoption rate and all of that is all questions, do you have good measurement mechanism in your organizations to actually see the adoption rate and what the response of the users using your services, not developers, but actual users, that so you know where we are standing from that standpoint, if you're deviating, where they're using it?
Yeah. So I actually have a monthly meeting with our end user support team, who every month gives me back what we call our MPI score, which is a satisfaction rating. And it's done on a survey of 500 people, 500 employees throughout the company in every region around the globe, in every business. And they get comments back, and some of them are incredibly blunt, but we get the best kind of metric that we could get. And actually, that getting back has informed our product roadmaps to include features, and we've started to see that MPI score go up. So I'll just tell, the identity team has got the highest MPI score of any of the corporate services that are going out there. But again, it's being okay with, I'm a Boy Scout leader for many, many years. And one of the things they taught us, the first thing they taught us was feedback is a gift. And sometimes it's a hard gift to receive. And again, some of these comments sometimes are hard to read, but there's truth in all of them. And you can't dislike the message. You have to absorb it and then deal with it and use it to inform your process.
You both come with this role. Have you ever thought about rewarding people, users, following your policies?
Repeat.
So the question was, have you thought about rewarding users in terms of either following policy, but using product? Like, how complete maybe is that feedback loop?
We have, I have some stories. I guess, one of the things I'll say, just to answer your question, Vlad, is, befriend Google Analytics. Let's just make sure that you master this thing. I mean, it's something that didn't exist a few years ago, and now it is there, and it's incredible. Our features, in many cases, you define the metric by which you're going to measure it before we develop it. And I'll say that's true for a lot of the new features and that has paid off, by the way. Because what's interesting is when we talk to the UX research or the designers, we talk about these metrics, and we use that to test, say, the prototype, the mock-up. Is it testing well? Yes, so we'll carry those metrics forward and make sure that is the case. And it's very satisfying when you see, for example, we find very recently we were doing analytics on some of our flows, and we found that we can clearly tell that there was a flow that needed usability improvements, and it wasn't a security or a fraudster or someone trying to hack into a system that was taking longer. And it was completely data-driven. So that was very satisfying. I had very few moments like that in my career. As far as engaging with customers, yes, I'm part of the feed. We have a social media feed, talk about feedback feedback that sometimes is a hard gift to receive, I guess. And you know, I have to orchestrate the responses to our media feed, so it's a very, very humbling experience. We do reward customers. I remember there was a customer that we chose to pilot a new adaptive authentication feature that we rolled out, and it was extremely painful for their use. But they volunteered and they stuck with us, and you know, we did reward them, and you know, they're part of our early adopter program. It takes all sort of shapes, by the way. I think that clients that really want a good experience care less about the reward at the end of it and more about what you're actually going to do for them that'll improve the experience.
So we're running low on time. So I'd ask the panel, concise, a couple words of wisdom to fellow practitioners on keys to programmatic success. Not something you can pack into 3 words, but something concise, things that you've found as a real nugget to take your programs forward.
Well, when it was 3 words, I was just going to use relationship, and relationship. The relationship that we have to our end users, the relationship that we have to our developers, and then the identity relationship management services that we're trying to build to address the needs of both of those communities. So we want to reduce friction for our end users, which is an easy one to understand, but we want to reduce friction for our developers as well.
I would say, you know, each of us know who our stakeholders. Once you have identified that, I think the concise, I would say, is be proactive and reach out. And to your point, it's a relationship, right? Invest in that relationship.
Well, I'll try to make it in 3 words as well. So in my view, I think empathy, which obviously is the fuel for relationship, you have to develop a discipline to measure. That is something I've just learned. I think that's quite important. And I think you have to have a backbone. And I say that with complete integrity. You're going to get it wrong. You're going to make mistakes. And you're going to have to live by that. You have to have the humility to say, well, we got that wrong. We're going to correct it. But that backbone is what builds the relationship.
They still all the good answers. To quote the newsroom, I'm just going to say freedom and more freedom. No, kidding. I really like what Steve said with respect to the relationship, because I think that's really, it speaks to all of those elements, particularly the culture, where no matter who your stakeholder is, if they know that you care and that you care specifically about their problems, you're much more likely to get buy-in with whatever you're trying to do. I know that sounds a little pithy, but there's truth to it.
So I want to thank the panel first for their openness and answering their questions, and thank the audience for playing along and engaging. The gents will be around. Most of their voices still function, but we can enlist a translator for Steve. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.